I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And in this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, we talk once again to Ambassador Dennis Ross, a graduate of UCLA. He's former director of the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Staff in the George H.W. Bush administration, and he served as Middle East envoy under President Bill Clinton and played a major role in Middle East peace negotiations in a number of presidential administrations, and was Special Mideast Coordinator and Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, as well as having served as a member of the nation's national security staff. He's been a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown. He's taught at Marquette, Brandeis, and Harvard, and has published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and he was an analyst for Fox News. The author of, a couple of books. Let me mention The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for Mideast peace, an excellent book, and most recently another excellent book called Statecraft, How to Restore America's Standing in the World. He presently serves as Distinguished Fellow with the Washington Institute, and I welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Always good to be with you.
And always good to be with you, and congratulations on the book, which I'm eager and anxious to talk to you about. Let's talk first, though, about the Middle East. They tie in, certainly, but where are we at? That's really what I'm interested in getting from you.
Well, the problem with the Middle East is there's not just one issue on where we're at. There's a question of where are we at in terms of possible negotiations between the Trump administration and Iran on the nuclear issue. I think there actually is some potential. President Trump doesn't want a war. The Iranians have never been as vulnerable as they are today, partly vulnerable because the Israelis have taken out their air defense. They've never been, I think, as on shaky ground domestically because of the economic circumstances. To put this in perspective, their currency, the official trading rate of their currency is 42,000 rial to the dollar. That's the official exchange rate. The actual exchange rate is 1,040,000 to the dollar, meaning the currency has been devalued to the point where if you had a savings account, it isn't worth anything anymore. A country that produces natural gas and oil can't provide electricity, so frequently it's forcing the government, businesses, and schools to be closed. This is a country that literally does not have water to meet the needs of its people, so a couple hours a day, water is shut off. That'll only get worse. So on the part of the Iranians, they have a need for a deal. And they see an opportunity because President Trump says he wants a deal. Within the Trump administration, there's not a very clear objective. The president says they can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, by that standard, they don't have a nuclear weapon today. So they're a threshold nuclear weapon state, but they don't have one. But then you have his national security advisor says they have to dismantle their entire nuclear infrastructure, which they won't do. We might move to disarm it, but they won't give up a nuclear infrastructure that also is designed to provide civil nuclear power. So what is the objective? My new book on statecraft focuses very heavily on marrying objectives and means, and one of the reasons frequently we fail to do it is because we don't adopt a very clear objective. Right now, the administration doesn't have a clear objective. If you listen to Steve Witkoff, who is a negotiator, he sends a message that maybe we're talking about limiting the amount of enrichment, limiting what could be a weapons program and being able to verify that. That's a far cry from dismantling their nuclear infrastructure. So the question is, what is the administration's objective? My sense is the prospect of a framework agreement between the Trump administration and the Iranians is actually fairly high. I don't mean 90%, but if I say I think it's 50-50, I will almost have never described negotiations with the Iranians as being something where the prospect is 50-50. So that tells you the odds are pretty significant. and a lot will depend upon how clear are we in terms of the objective we have. You can bet that the Iranians know what they want, so don't put ourselves at a disadvantage by not being clear on what we want.
Also brings to mind, though, when President Trump was talking about getting North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. I mean, like you said, Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon yet, but that's something despite his love affair with Kim Jong-un and all the goodwill that he extended to that dictator. There was nothing that really came as a result of that in terms of those kinds of issues. Nothing.
Well, there were all sorts of videos done to show the kinds of condominiums that the North Koreans could have if they would just reach a deal. Obviously, a deal wasn't made. I think in these circumstances, the prospect of a deal are significantly higher, mostly because the Iranians want to make sure the Israelis will not act militarily against them. They are. It's hard to exaggerate how vulnerable they are to Israeli attacks right now. The Israelis on the night of October 26 took out their strategic air defense against the Israelis. So the Israelis can operate with impunity above Iran, number one. They took out 90% of their ballistic missile producing capability. So from an Israeli standpoint, there's obviously a window. And Trump is trying to use the leverage of that threat, which, by the way, again, effective statecraft is one where you know how to build your leverage to increase the incentives of those you're dealing with to reach an understanding with you. So he is making those kinds of threats, and that's, I think, is appropriate. But if you send constantly mixed signals about what it is you're trying to do, that basically works to the benefit of the other side. It doesn't necessarily work to your benefit. Whatever the ambiguity is on our side or the differences on our side, you can bet the Iranians will try to take advantage of that.
Iranians are also very divided. I mean, when I think about the present executive leadership in Iran, it's a little more slightly to the left than it's been in the past, but you also have the Revolutionary Guard, and you never know what the Ayatollah's position is going to be. I mean, he's at least allowed these talks to take place. But I can't help thinking when we talk about the existential threat of Iran, and Iran is, like you say, the Middle East brings up so many different number of stratas of discourse for us. But Turkey is moving more and more in a direction against Israel as well. I mean, we have to talk about Hamas, obviously, when we're talking about opposition to Israel and the ongoing war. But it seems like Erdogan wants to be in opposition, stronger opposition.
Well, it's interesting because I think Turkey and Iran have always been competitors. Now, you have Iran forced out of Syria as a result of the fall of Bashar al-Assad. You have Ahmed al-Shara, who is now this kind of interim president. He clearly was a member of ISIS, of al-Qaeda. He has changed. He turned against both of them. He's certainly sending a signal that he's different, but he has been supported by the Turks. The Turks see an opportunity to take advantage of Iran being out. They see an opportunity to take advantage of a regime that is dependent on them. They see it as an opening to sort of deal with the Kurdish threat from Syria. The Israelis worry that Shara may still be an Islamist and the Turks are backing him. So they want to limit the potential risks there. They have to be careful because it's not just the issue of Turkey. It's also Shara is clearly someone who has booted the Iranians out. That's a positive thing from Israel's standpoint. The question is he really changing who he is? Is he the pragmatist that he's certainly trying to create the world to believe exists? There are plenty of people who are dealing with it who think he really is not an Islamist any longer. The best indication of that is you don't have a country in the region that is more against the Muslim Brotherhood, more against al-Qaeda than the Saudis. And the Saudis right now have met with him and they've made a judgment. They've actually paid off Syria's World Bank debt. They've made a judgment that he's a different coloration and there's a chance to have someone running Syria who will not be dependent on the Syrians, will not be dependent on anybody else who the Saudis might see as being threatening, including the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists. And so they're kind of betting on him. The interesting thing with the Trump administration is there are those within the administration who believe once an Islamist, always an Islamist, and others who are thinking at least that maybe there's a bit of an opening here. What is, I think, often going to be the case with this administration is you're going to have different factions, but there's only one person who's authoritative in the administration, and that's the president. And it's not clear where he comes from on this.
We also have, resistance still from the Alawites in certain regions of Syria, and you have, like you say, the division with the Kurds, which the Turks would like to take under complete control and sort of vanquish them. But there are a lot of recipes for potential ongoing disaster, is really what I'm saying.
Well, I think that's right. No, I think it's a fair point. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainties. There's also something else, though. Israel changed the military balance of power in the region. They haven't declared victory in Gaza, and we can talk more about that because I'm very uneasy about the lack of an Israeli strategy. But the Israeli military basically has defeated Hamas, so it's no longer a military. By the way, the only time you see Hamas in uniform now is when there's a ceasefire and they have a celebration, of the releasing a hostage. Otherwise, they're not in uniform because they're not a military anymore. Hezbollah has been decimated. One of the reasons the Israelis think about acting against the Iranians is not only because of the vulnerability of Iran now, but it's also because the 150,000 rockets that Hezbollah had as a deterrent against Israel striking Iran, that's gone. So that threat isn't there. The Assad, who was basically the land bridge to Hezbollah, he's gone. And al-Shara's regime is acting pretty consistently to prevent any arms smuggling through Syria into Lebanon. So that's changed. And then Iran itself is dramatically weaker right now. So the regional balance of power has shifted dramatically. The problem is not that. The problem is there's an opportunity. How do you take advantage of that by having a political strategy that produces outcomes that can be more enduring? Clausewitz said, war is a continuation of politics by other means. What we've seen is the war. What we haven't seen is the strategy to recognize war is not an end in itself. War is an instrument. When I talk about statecraft, I'm talking about all the instruments of the state. War and the military, they're an instrument. They're not an end in themselves. So we have to be focused not just on objectives, but how we mobilize the means we have to achieve those objectives. Right now in the Middle East, you have a range of possibilities, but you also have all these uncertainties. One example of a possibility, Saudi normalization with Israel. Be a dramatic change. Saudis won't do that so long as Israel's in Gaza.
They've also said they won't do it until there's a Palestinian state, or at least a movement toward a Palestinian state, and that looks, I'm sorry to say, in many respects, less likely now. I was just thinking about Smotrich and some of these people on the far right who are saying, we've got to, free the hostages is maybe not so important a goal. It's more of an important goal to go in and build settlements in Gaza or to take over land in Gaza or to make sure that things are safe vis-a-vis Syria, as you were talking before. In other words, that whole picture is still there.
This Israeli government has within it people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir for whom they want to resume occupation of Gaza. They want to annex the West Bank. They want to turn Israel into one state where Palestinians would leave. The Prime Minister of Israel says he doesn't want to do that, but he certainly is allowing them to continue to be a fundamental arbiter of what the policies are.
Yeah.
And because of them, he never developed a strategy for the day after, which is necessary for Israel's interest. You talk to anybody in the Israeli military, and the very last thing they want to do is occupy Gaza. I think the vast majority of Israelis have no interest in occupying Gaza. But you have a part of this government that is pushing for things that ultimately are quite self-destructive for Israel's future.
And maybe envisaging a beach resort that Gaza could be, as has been at least postulated by our president. And it prompts me to get back to statecraft and some thoughts from you on the role that our president has played. I mean, on the one hand, he has said release the hostages or else, and sounded like he's waving a sword and he's going to take drastic action and all of that sort of thing. And then and a lot of your background, of course, is in Soviet history and Soviet politics, saying that he's going to solve the Ukraine-Russian conflict the first day, or then he said, well, I was just being sarcastic. And that doesn't necessarily contribute to statecraft when you talk in those ridiculous and absurd or almost ludicrous kinds of, and you don't follow through.
One of the keys is having others believe you. Now, he's right that there's a time. Thomas Schelling used to write about the rationality of irrationality. It creates a concern that you might do unpredictable things that are frightening. It's sort of the madman theory of policy making. The problem is that if you don't follow through, then the kind of broad claims then aren't believed. I think President Trump's leverage will begin to diminish increasingly unless he produces successes. I mean, a lot depends again on what are the instruments he's using and for what end. For example, let's take the tariffs. If the tariffs are about trying to change the terms of trade, they can be an instrument that could be useful, and you could be producing bilateral deals. If the tariffs are designed to change the structure of the American economy and bring manufacturing back, that looks wholly less credible for a simple reason. I don't know which parts of the manufacturing infrastructure you can bring back. Are you talking about bringing back textiles to North Carolina? Highly unlikely. Are you talking about you're going to rebuild beyond what we have the auto industry here? Fine, except what are the supply chains? Most of the materials that the auto industry depends on come from outside. When you raise the tariffs, you're raising the costs, or you're complicating the supply chain. If it's just changing the terms of trade, and again, he's said, since the 1980s that he believes we've been ripped off by others, and that the terms of trade have been unfair. By the way, he's not totally wrong. There's an element of that. If you want to be correcting that, yes, a strategic approach to tariffs, not a scattergun approach, not a kind of tariffs across the board, but a strategic approach to tariffs could be, in fact, a smart policy and could be smart statecraft. But what makes it smart is it's targeted. What makes it smart is you have the means to act on it, and you can create the leverage to get others to respond to you.
It doesn't seem to me very advisable statecraft, though, to essentially stir up enmity among one's allies and one's closest allies. And that's what the tariffs, to some degree, are doing, although there hasn't been consistency from the president. I mean, in terms of statecraft, it seems to me that one of the most efficacious forms of statecraft is a kind of consistency. That is not the case with tariffs at all. Just the opposite, isn't it?
Well, it could be if they were strategically targeted. If you had a clear priority list, and the last list was not only with countries, but it was also with sectors, specific industries. Look, the targeting when it comes to chip making, that could make a lot of sense. But when you take a broad brush and you just apply it across the board with no, in a sense, with no effort to select or discriminate or prioritize, you're much less likely to be successful. I mean, good statecraft is you marry your objectives and means. Your objectives are very clear. You know how to marshal all the tools at your disposal. You know also how to mobilize allies. President Trump views allies as being a drain on us. Historically, allies add to your power. They don't subtract from your power. But he views alliances through the lens that, A, they don't bear the burden. They don't bear the burden that they should bear. It's unequal. B, they've taken advantage of us in terms of the terms of trade, and he wants a kind of compensation for that. Now, and I said, some of this is legitimate, but if you take this broad brush and you begin to weaken the alliance system, you're not strengthening the United States. We are stronger. I mean, I'll just give an example on Ukraine. The president likes to say we've given $300 billion, and we've given $111 billion roughly. The Europeans have given roughly $131 billion. Now, Isn't that an example of getting a major benefit from your allies? It's not a subtraction, it's an addition. And it allows you to have a chance at succeeding. I worry now that the signals we're sending are such that, if the president says, okay, we're washing our hands of this, that ends up tilting towards the Russians, because the washing our hands of it means we're going to stop providing military assistance to the Ukrainians. Then you're basically saying to Putin, I don't care what you do.
Well, he's always been tilting toward the Russians. I mean, just the sort of proposals being put forward. Well, admit it. You've got Crimea. He's got Crimea. He's going to hold on to Crimea. I mean, that's essentially the deal that the great deal maker Donald Trump has worked out for Ukraine.
And one of the great things about if you're a serious deal maker, one of the things you never do is put your bottom lines up front, because they'll end up being transgressed. So what you thought were your bottom lines turn out not to be your bottom lines, and you give away much more.
Exactly. It's also sort of counterintuitive in many ways to, as far as statecraft is concerned, to come out with a lot of mendacity. That's the best word that fits at least what I'm trying to convey here, to say that all these nations are begging to make deals when the proof is simply not there. And as you point out in your book, we're not in the unipolar world anymore. It's very much a bipolar world in terms of power. And when you're diffusing the possibility of alliances, as opposed to that wonderful example that you get into when we went to Kuwait under Bush, when you were working hand in glove with that administration and very much a part of it. I like the distinction you make, by the way, by going into the Iraq War as opposed to the earlier decision there was a multinational decision, and how that all worked out. But I'm just saying mendacity, meaning you're just putting a lot of BS out there that doesn't make any sense.
I do think, if you make very broad claims, but you don't deliver on your claims, others are mindful of that, and they will interpret later on what they hear through that kind of a lens. If you're going to be taken serious, this is what I mean by the president's leverage is going to dissipate over time unless he succeeds in terms of what he's doing. The measure of success is he produces deals where he actually does change the terms of trade. And you go back to his first term, he hated NAFTA, negotiated a new deal with Canada and Mexico, which, by the way, was an improvement, but it was a marginal improvement. It wasn't a transformation. It was a marginal improvement, and it might have been the sort of thing that any administration that would have updated what were the terms of trade as a result of NAFTA. By the way, if you're walking away from a deal you did in the first term, it does raise questions in the minds of others. Well, what's the value of doing a deal with you, because I don't know how long you're going to stick to it. So being credible in terms of what you say will count for a lot. It will actually add to the weight of threats he makes. It won't detract from the threats he might make.
And you're really strong on the idea of restoring America's standing in the world. I mean, that is a major motif in your book, and there's a lot of thrust toward that. It sounds, I suppose, to some people like Make America Great Again or something along those lines, but using diplomacy and using all the tools of diplomacy in ways that really can make America's standing in the world strong once more. It's not done through punishing our allies with tariffs, though, it would seem to me pretty logically.
In doing this book, I did the original book on statecraft I did in 2006. This book that I've just done, which is Statecraft 2.0, that's why it's a different world since the one I wrote in 2006. And one of the things I take on in this book is we don't have the luxury any longer of doing statecraft badly, because in 2006, when I wrote the first book, it was a unipolar world. It wasn't a multipolar world. We didn't have competitors. We didn't have, Russia basically was in a position where they couldn't compete. China was still using our access to build itself up. The Iranians might be a challenge, but they weren't the same challenge that they are today. Same with North Korea. And we had more of a domestic consensus. Even though Iraq basically split the country in many respects, there wasn't a fundamental question about should the U.S. play a leading role in the world. Today, we don't have that consensus. Should we play a leading role in the world? We had the populist reaction that we're seeing in all the democracies. It's not just our country. You see it in Europe. You see it in Israel. Every democracy has had a kind of populist nationalist reaction. So for us to be able to convince the American public to retain a leadership role, we have to show we're effective in doing it. And that's the thrust of what I'm arguing. You're effective when you can marry your objectives and means, when you can mobilize the tools from others, not just ourselves, when you have soft power. Soft power is a form of attraction. It draws others to you. When you can frame issues, you take the initiative and you frame issues and so that others are responding to you. And in a way where they're attracted to you, that builds your power. It doesn't detract from your power. And that's what I'm trying to say is, I don't believe the world is as stable a place when the U.S. can't play a leading role. So I was creating a construct in this book to say, okay, this is what it will take for us to continue to play a leading role at a time when we're more challenged on the outside and when we lack a domestic consensus on the inside.
And China is succeeding far greater in soft power than the United States now. I mean, they're actually become kind of a beacon almost in many ways in what they're doing in Africa and developing nations as opposed to the United States. I'm also mindful of reading your book about how important marrying the two forces together is in terms of climate change and cyber and pandemics and all the challenges that really are tied to statecraft.
One of the things I wanted to do was to say, let's look at the non-traditional threats to national security. And when you talk about climate change, which is a much more profound threat than I think is fully understood, when you talk about pandemics and when you talk about cyber threats, no borders. They respect no borders. We can't succeed when it comes to climate without a real common strategy with the Chinese. Now, the truth is, we both have that need. It's not a favor one is doing to the other. It's a mutual need. So this is one of those areas where we ought to be able to cooperate. When it comes to pandemics, it's the same thing. And we saw it. The Chinese were slow to reveal what they knew about not just the origins of the virus, but it took a little while before they were sharing in labs the virus itself and the genetic makeup of the virus. Once we knew the genetic makeup of the virus, it was possible then to produce a vaccine and a vaccine really quickly. And the reason was because the genetic makeup of the virus was so similar to SARS. And NIH, which right now appears to be being gutted, NIH at the time of SARS in 2002, 2003, went ahead and developed a vaccine for that. So the reason we could produce a vaccine, the NIH could basically come up with a vaccine within 40 days, was because they were using what they had produced back in 2002, 2003. And here again, you need collaboration across borders, and you need it with the Chinese in particular. So China is a competitor for sure, and it's not easy to reassure them because they think anything we do to try to develop coalitions to limit the kind of things they do, they think we're trying to deny them their legitimate rise. They think we're trying to deny them their destiny. So anything we do to deter them, they're going to misinterpret. On the other hand, what I'm suggesting in the China chapter is, in the approach to China, why not in every single meeting create an agenda where the agenda starts with the issues we have in common, which we actually have quite a few. So climate change, pandemics, terror, proliferation, all of these are issues that neither one of us can resolve on our own. We need to be with each other. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to compete. We're going to compete, but maybe we create a context in which in every meeting, first you focus on the things that you're going to do jointly, because it's not a favor to the other, it's a benefit to both. And then you can say, all right, in light of this, all right, how do we manage the areas where we're going to compete so that those areas of competition don't become too risky and don't increase the risk of a conflict between us.
However, we are terribly in debt to the Chinese financially, and that's just a reality, and it may come home to roost. I don't know when or how, but we also have to factor in what would happen if they decided to go for Taiwan, which it almost seems inevitably they will, or going to the South China Sea. I mean, the definite ambitions are there, aren't they?
Absolutely, they're there. They still believe that they can achieve what they want in terms of a unification with Taiwan over time and peacefully. It is in our interest for them to believe that the costs of trying to do it militarily are prohibitive and too high for them, too risky for them. That's where the issue of deterrence, I think, comes in. That's where the issue of having coalitions. One of the things that Biden did effectively was to settle the differences between Japan and South Korea, which we tend not to be mindful of, but they were quite profound. This was a way to bring the three of us together so that, in fact, we represent a common approach to the Chinese. Working out, coming up with this arrangement with India, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. This was, again, a very effective means for limiting what the Chinese can do. Even the one of the things that I think Trump may yet follow through on, even though it'll be called something different, no doubt. The U.S. worked out an agreement with India, the Saudis, and the Europeans to create infrastructure that connects India to the Gulf to Europe. By the way, it would have to run through Israel. So it was a brilliant way of developing a much more effective set of infrastructure for doing trade, commercial activity. It was a competition with the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese, which started off remarkably so for China, but it ended up creating huge amounts of debt in the countries where they were building the infrastructure, by the way, with their own labor, not with the labor of the country. And the Chinese were not willing to relax the debt, forgive the debt, restructure the debt. Increasingly, they're going to have to do that. Otherwise, there's going to be defaults. So something that looked like it was an enormous advantage for them has become somewhat of a liability.
When you talk about, and as you just did, for example, Biden, and when you write about Biden, you're pretty favorable in terms of his international geopolitical stances and the views that he had and so forth. Does that, especially since you have been identified with the Democratic Party, does that open you up to biases type criticism in the same way that maybe being Jewish did when you were doing Mideast negotiations?
You let your analysis speak for itself. And when you read this book, there's no ad hominems. It's really very much straight analysis. There are places where I'm critical of Biden too.
Especially Afghanistan. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Afghanistan was a disaster the way it was done. That was an example of very bad statecraft. And it had an implication. There's no question in my mind that it conveyed an image of weakness. And I think in terms of Putin, to be fair, it wasn't just Afghanistan. If it had been only Afghanistan, it might have been one thing. But Afghanistan on top of basically a lack of response to what they did in Georgia, a lack of response to what they did in Crimea.
Yeah.
There is a track record of doing very little in response. And then you see a kind of terrible, chaotic pullout from Afghanistan. It sort of cemented his image. I'm not running much of a risk. Now, that turned out to be a colossal miscalculation for him. It's one of the reasons I said it. Trump right now has a lot of leverage on Putin if he would only use it.
Instead, he's yelling, "Stop, Vladimir," and Truth Social. I mean, and people are saying, well, finally he's maybe standing up in a way. But, that's after they sat down to try to make a deal. And there was this rather vicious attack that Putin took. And Putin will probably continue to take vicious attacks, even though he's losing immense amounts of not only money, but also Russian lives. I want to get back, though, to your idea, which is so central, about marrying objectives and means. The policymakers, on a number of occasions, you kind of suggest, don't necessarily, or they have difficulty defining what the right objectives are. And that becomes a central stumbling block, a major stumbling block in any kind of statecraft.
I open my class on statecraft by saying to my students, all right, good statecraft is always marrying objectives and means. Obvious, right? A given, right?
It's an elemental, yeah.
Right. why wouldn't you, if you're going to adopt a policy, why wouldn't you marry objectives and means? And the answer is because we frequently adopt the wrong objective. Now, why do we frequently adopt the wrong objectives? Sometimes we just haven't a clue as to what we're getting into. Look at Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, look at George W. Bush in Iraq. They had no idea what they were getting into. The assessments that they had were simply wrong. They were ideologically driven. They weren't fact-based. So sometimes we don't get what we're going into. That explains it. Sometimes you adopt an objective for purely a political reason. When President Obama adopted the objective that Bashar al-Assad has to leave Syria, it was based on pressures building up because
red
the numbers.
line.
Yes, but so these were staked out based on political pressures, without thinking through. Okay, once I do this, what are the implications in terms of what I will now do to fulfill it? But that wasn't thought through. Sometimes the objectives are just adopted at such a high level of generality, that you don't have a means. You can't operationalize an objective that is at such a high level of generality. Now, the lesson there is we need to ask hard questions. Before you adopt an objective, what are you trying to achieve? Why are you trying to achieve it? Do your stakes justify running high risk to achieve it? If your stakes are low, then feasibility should determine what the objective is. If your stakes are high, well, then you're prepared to run pretty significant risks. I'll give an example. George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker both thought that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was a profound threat to the United States. And I was traveling with Baker at the time, 4 days after the invasion, and George W. Bush said, "This will not stand." All right, I'm on the plane. We're actually in the Middle East at the time. Baker turns to me when we see this come across, and he says, "Well, that tells you that if you and I," he says, "Listen, pal, if you and I fail diplomatically, it means we're in war." So it was a very clear understanding of what it meant. But the reason the stakes were so high is because Bush was convinced we were at a kind of turning point internationally. The Cold War was ending, and he wanted to ensure that it was going to be the rule of law and not the law of the jungle that was going to shape this new era. So he defined the stakes as being really high. When you define the stakes as really high, it means you're prepared to go very far in terms of the means you will use.
Baker was a strong model for you in terms of statecraft. I mean, he was one who certainly exercised it with a great deal of prudence and good judgment, wasn't he?
Baker was always looking at what are we trying to do and why are we trying to do it. He would always ask hard questions. He never took anything as a given. As a negotiator, I learned a lot from him as a negotiator. He was always thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. So yes, I was very much influenced by the way he did things, and he also, there was an integrity to him, just because that defines him. But he was very straight with people. He understood, and one of the things I say to my students again about diplomacy, which is one of the tools of statecraft. It's not the sum total of statecraft. In diplomacy, you don't exercise diplomacy effectively through indirection. That just leads to misunderstanding. It doesn't mean you're provocative. It doesn't mean you have to stick your thumb in somebody's eye, especially in public. But in private, you're very clear, so you leave no chance of misunderstanding. One of the things I learned over time, in negotiations or in diplomacy, when there's a misunderstanding, the other side will always believe you deliberately misled them. It's never seen as being innocent. It's never seen as, oh, it was just an accident. And then you'll spend a lot of time trying to recover, to overcome that perception that there was a deliberate kind of misleading. So from Baker, one of the things I saw very clearly, you can be very straight. You can say one thing in public so that you're not putting someone in the corner, But in private, you need to be very direct, not provocative, but very direct so there's no misunderstanding.
Well, since we're talking about Baker, and I want to talk about tools of statecraft with you, but let's talk about Rubio and how you see him. I want you, if you wouldn't mind getting on the record, because, he was talking about how terrible it was that Putin invaded Ukraine, and now he seems to have done a complete turnaround on that.
Look, when I look at Rubio's history on most of the issues, I find myself, at least in the national security area, I find myself pretty comfortable with him. I think it also, most of his colleagues, look, he had almost a uniform backing from the Senate in his confirmation hearing. He's operating with President Trump, and it's clear when you look at Rubio, when you look at the Secretary of Treasury, you see people who have a career of being seen one way, trying their best to prove themselves to the president. And I think in the hopes that that will create political space for them to be able to operate. I look at what Rubio says about Ukraine today, and it reflects where President Trump's coming from. It doesn't reflect where he has historically come from.
I like also at one point where you say even Plato writes about statecraft, and but Bismarck practiced it.
Yeah.
It's an important distinction. And Bismarck was one of the geniuses of statecraft. Let's talk about the tools, though, because there are so many. I mean,
Right.
And you bring them all up and make us acutely aware of what goes into the tool shed.
So, yeah, and people like to talk about the tool shed or the toolkit that we have. The obvious ones are obviously diplomacy, finance, economic, military, but organizational, informational, especially in an era where we're looking at not traditional media having the same impact that social media has. TikTok is sort of a formative means for younger people getting their news. It's a complete distortion. So one of the things you have to think about, and I talk a lot about framing of issues. Framing of issues, I mentioned it before, framing of issues is critical because you want others to embrace your objective. It makes it a whole lot easier to achieve your objective if others are embracing your objective. So you have to think about what's the best way to present it, not only in terms of its content, but also what's the medium, what's the best platform. One of the things we used to have, all over the world, we used to have these U.S. information libraries all over the world. And it was a form of soft power, but it was also a form of exposure and conveying American ideas and American ideas. It was American media was present, traditional media was present there. Today, you need to have something that's the equivalent of that. In social media, it means you need to think about what your content is, but it also means you need to think about people who design these kinds of platforms, have them think through what are the best ways to get certain messages to go viral. I often say, in foreign policy, you want to create certain mantras and have them repeatable. You need to think about how you do that in social media as well, as a way of...
In some ways, that's like PR and ad writing, isn't it? It has that element.
The people who used to head the USIA, almost all of them came out of the ad world.
Yeah.
Almost all of them. Because they understood it was packaging. It was a packaging of ideas. So, it's not less important today. In some ways, it may be even more important, but the format is different. And the people who know how to use this format, they're different. And they understand, how you take something and transform it into something that goes viral very quickly.
So it's not only diplomacy that we're talking about here when we're talking about statecraft and all the tools that you mentioned. It's also being mindful of who your audience is and how to get your audience, on your side.
Yes. But here's where very active diplomacy comes in. One of the things that Baker used to do brilliantly, when we were putting together the Gulf War Coalition, in private, he would say to the leaders he was meeting with, we're going to go ahead and do this. We'd like you to be with us. You tell me what I can say publicly here that will help you. A smart diplomacy is about, oftentimes, I used to say in my negotiations, help me to help you. This is what will help me to do more for you. And, when you're showing a level of interest in someone else and saying, I get your problem. I really do. I get your problem. And you don't just say, I get your problem. You then describe what the problem is so they know you really do get it. And then you say, okay, look, let's talk together about how we're going to deal with this. You find that those who are your allies, it's one thing, but those who aren't your allies, you end up turning them into people who can be partners. And oftentimes it's non-allies who may have the greatest leverage on those whose behavior you want to change.
So kindness and empathy and those kind of virtues do play a role, and they should play a role, even though people think of this as kind of often hard-headed Machiavellianism, and what has to be using whatever means one can.
Yeah, well, think about it. I often say I have rules for negotiations, and one of the rule is what I call the empathy rule, and I say it's not a self-sacrificing rule. If you want someone to be responsive to you, you have to demonstrate you understand what's important to them. When you're only talking to them and telling them or lecturing them, you're not learning what's important to them.
Can we go back for a moment to the negotiations with Arafat? Because he comes to mind here.
Well, not every negotiation can succeed. You still, and this is, by the way, one of the things that I find troubling with some of the people who want to retrench. And by the way, they're on the left and the right. You have some of the retrenchers on the right blame America for everything internationally, and it's the same thing for some of the people on the left. They ignore that sometimes you deal with actors who have actual aggressive intent, whose interests are hostile to ours, and you have to be prepared to recognize that. When I talk about an empathy rule, it's not saying, okay, we're prepared to accept that you're aggressive and that you have aggressive intentions. With them, you have to basically make it clear there's a cost. You can still say to them, there's something you can gain, but here's what you stand to lose. With Arafat, I think in retrospect, I think one of my failings was I needed to construct a better test. What I mean by that, President Clinton used to always say, look, I think that Arafat is for real. I think he wants to do this. And I would say to him, I'm not sure. But I never constructed the right tests. What I needed, and it by the way, it occurred to me only on the third day of Camp David after we were there. I realized that the right test was to basically go to Barack and Arafat and to say to them that we're here to close a deal to resolve all the final status issues. We understand that means you have to take on history and mythology, and you'll never have to do anything as hard, and we'll never have to do anything as hard as what you have to do. But I have to know that we can actually get there. And to know we can get there, I have to see that you're prepared to make these kinds of decisions that are going to produce a political backlash. And if I know that's the case, we'll go all out and we'll do whatever it takes on our end. Now, what we should have done is with Arafat and with Barack, and we could have come up with a common script, we had to have each of them explaining the areas where they were prepared to make concessions on, for example, not getting 100% of what you want on security, not getting 100% of what you want on Jerusalem, not getting 100% of what you want on refugees. The point was, the minute one of them began to talk about compromise on one of those issues, it was going to produce a big blowback. Now, their readiness to do that would have demonstrated their seriousness to really go to the end and finish it. And their readiness to do that would have given them an enormous incentive to try to reach an agreement quickly to show what they got for being prepared to make concessions on those kinds of issues. If I had constructed this before we went to Camp David, we would have learned the following. Barack would have resisted us. In the end, he would have done it because we would have said, if you don't do it, we're not going. And Arafat would not have done it because he wasn't prepared to make those kinds of concessions. He wasn't prepared, in a sense, to level with his public about what was going to be required. Now, what that would have led us to do is say, okay, look, we're not going to go for a complete comprehensive agreement now. We'll do more to expand the scope of Palestinian autonomy. We'll do more to build connections and networks and cooperation between the two publics and societies. We will lay the groundwork for the future for when there'll be a Palestinian leader who can make that decision. I wish I had done that. I wish I had come up with that and thought about it prior to day 3 of Camp David.
Important hindsight lesson, though, huh?
Well, I think, you probably learn, I wouldn't say probably, you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes.
I agree with that.
One of the things I do in the book, in a couple of places, I draw lessons from good examples of statecraft and bad examples of statecraft for how you construct what is the best approach to statecraft.
You seem to have at least somewhat of a positive view of Mohammed bin Salman now. I'm curious about that, especially in light of the horror of Khashoggi's killing and all the rest of it, yeah.
Well, look, he is transforming Saudi Arabia in a way that would not have been recognizable or even predictable. He is extremely popular in Saudi Arabia with people under the age of 35, which is more than 70% of the population. And he's extremely popular for a variety of reasons. First, women. I had I go to Saudi Arabia at least twice a year. And I'm going to give you the emblem of what I call the new Saudi Arabia. There is a place in Riyadh called You Walk, and it's a big promenade. And it runs about a mile, and all along the side of it, there are all sorts of restaurants, cafes, shopping areas, and so forth. So I was seeing 2 women walking arm in arm. One woman had bright red hair. Obviously, she was not wearing a headscarf. And she had a short skirt. So she was completely Western in her orientation. She's arm in arm with a woman who is covered head to toe. Not just with an abaya, but with a veil. So the only thing you see are, just the slit for the eyes. They're walking arm in arm. And the reason I say it's the new Saudi Arabia, they're comfortable with each other. First of all, you never would have seen a woman with red hair and bright red hair and dressed that way. You never would have seen it. That same you walk into any restaurant there, the odds are the maitre d' is a woman. Most of the servers are women. It would have been unheard of, unthinkable. So
and they're driving cars too.
Yeah, if you're in Riyadh and you want to get an Uber, the odds are your driver will be a woman. So this bears no relationship to the Saudi Arabia I first began going to in the late 1980s. So the country is being transformed, not a democracy, but there's clearly focus on governance, improving governance, and there's a recognition that you're not going to advance if you exclude half your population. The women now in the private sector make up more than a third of those who are working. When he came in, the number was like 8 or 9%, and that 8 or 9% were purely in kind of clerical support roles. Now they're women who have their own businesses. So the country is being transformed, not just economically, but socially. You go anywhere and you see men and women mixing, which you never saw before. So especially this is true in the urban areas. If you travel out into the countryside, the rural areas are always more traditional in attitude. So the same social kind of transformation, you're not necessarily seeing to the same extent there. But you're clearly seeing it in the cities, and you're clearly seeing it in almost every walk of life. What's offered at universities now is completely different. There are music departments. Music used to be outlawed. The Wahhabis basically outlawed it. Now you have, major effort in music and art, culture that, in a sense, was, mostly hidden. It wasn't allowed. You weren't allowed to express yourself. If you go, to give you another example, in Daria, which is where the foundations of the Saud family were, you see 2 interesting things. The Wahhabi, they do a 10-minute show and light show that shows the history of Saudi Arabia and of basically the Saud family. And there's no reference to Wahhabism. It's as if it doesn't exist. it's not the religion that's emphasized, it's the national identity that's emphasized. The source of modernization in Saudi Arabia today is nationalism and modernization, not religion.
Well, it prompts me to ask you, because before you were talking about the Saudis possibly having a role with respect to Mideast peace. In fact, my own theory, and it seems to be supported for the most part, is that at least part of the motivation of Hamas attacking Israel when it did was to ensure that the Saudis would not broker a peace or would not move more toward getting some goodies from the United States that would make them at least be open to brokering or helping to broker a peace. But at this point, they've become closer in many ways with Iran, and that's a kind of a wild card in all this. I mean, it seems even less likely that they would move toward some kind of pragmatic rapprochement or whatever you want to call it with Israel.
I think you were right. Right before October 7th, 2023, the Biden administration thought before the end of the year they would have a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, the Saudis haven't given up on that, but they basically said they start with the premise, so long as the Gaza war is going on, nothing can be done on normalization. So long as Israel's in Gaza, nothing can be done. There is, and I want to digress for a second because I think it helps to explain this point. There are two realities in the Middle East today. If you go to Israel, all you see are pictures of the hostages. You don't see anything about the death and destruction in Gaza. The weight of the trauma of October 7th is so heavy on the Israelis that in many respects it's still October 7th in Israel. If you go to the Arab world, you don't see anything about Israeli hostages. You see only the death and destruction in Gaza. The mood towards Israel has soured dramatically among the Arab publics, and especially in Saudi Arabia. So from the Saudi standpoint, so long as Gaza goes on, the issue of normalization is literally off the table. When that's over, you still have to have a day after strategy. The Saudis talk about wanting to have a credible pathway for a Palestinian state. My position on that is the following.
Excuse me, they also talk about the Palestinian Authority coming in and having a role in Gaza government, and that seems to be, frankly, not viable. I mean, it's a corrupt government, completely a corrupt government.
Yeah. It is not viable until they reform.
Yeah.
But this is something, look, in a sense, if you want to talk about a credible pathway to a Palestinian state, there's what the Israelis do, but there's also what the Palestinians have to do. I've said to the Saudis and others, I'll tell you what I would like to see. I would like to see the administration recognize the Palestinians as a people and say the Palestinians as a people have a right to self-determination. But they don't automatically get to act on that right unless they demonstrate something. If they're going to have independent militias, they can't have a state. If Hamas could leave them, they can't have a state. If they're going to align with Iran and the rejectionists, they're not ready for a state. If they're going to have a completely corrupt Palestinian Authority, they're going to have a failed state. So there are a number of conditions that some of which are tangible and you have to see them act on, some of which are more rhetorical, but they're important. The Palestinians have never recognized a historic Jewish connection to the land, which means they recognize the fact of Israel, but not its right to be there. The Palestinians need to change the core of their narrative from resistance to coexistence. Now, everything I'm describing on the Palestinian side doesn't mean that Israel has no obligations. You can't have an Israeli government with people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir who basically are acting to guarantee there can never be a Palestinian state. So you have to construct a parallel set of obligations on each side. If you do that and you focus on building from the ground up, we have to reestablish the idea that cooperation is something that's good for Israelis and Palestinians alike. By the way, even today, there's cooperation you don't see. Sewage coming out of Gaza basically forces the Israelis to turn off their desalination plant in Ashkelon. You have issues, just like I was talking about with the United States and China, except it's the same for Israel and the Palestinians, except they're much closer. The Israelis gave 1 million doses of the vaccine to the Palestinian Authority during COVID. Why? Because there's nothing that prevents disease from operating in the West Bank and then also affecting Israelis. So they live right next to each other. And so even today, there are forms of cooperation that nobody sees. One of the things we have to do, and I work with a couple of different NGOs, an Israeli NGO and a Palestinian NGO, and they do things together even now. What I'm pushing them both to do is to publicize what they do. We need Israelis and Palestinians both alike, who are both suffering from trauma right now. And look, you know what trauma means. Trauma means you feel your own pain, you can't feel anybody else's. There are parallel traumas, and the only way you can restore the idea of cooperation is for people to see it actually goes on and there's a benefit from it. When we start talking about trying to change the reality between Israelis and Palestinians after Gaza, it has to start there.
But the narratives remain so far apart. I mean, not only the narratives of the history, but also the narratives as they exist in terms of what you call trauma. I mean, I'm thinking about those who support the right-wing government and who support Netanyahu as opposed to those who support Hamas. And there's just a total kind of antithesis there. I mean, irreconcilable, at least so it would appear.
You won't have peace between Israelis and Palestinians until you have different leaderships in both places. That's just a fact.
Exactly, yeah. But it
will take time. Even with that, it's going to take time.
Well, let me pursue that just for a moment with you, because I was interested in what recently came out with the head of Shin Beth, the former head of Shin Beth, Roman Bar, who said that Netanyahu was...
he's still the head.
He's still technically the head.
Not for much longer, but he's still the head.
But he was talking about Netanyahu spying on protesters, and there was an affidavit put in front of the Supreme Court. Now, there's been this fight between Netanyahu and the Supreme Court in Israel, but it would disqualify Netanyahu from being prime minister. I don't know if it can go that far, but it's plausible.
Yeah, I don't think it will go that far, but I also think that you'll have an election next year in Israel, and there'll be a different government at that time. And the real reason for it will be, fundamentally, the Haredi issue, the exemption of the Haredi from the draft. You have people who've now served 200 to 300 days in the reserves, and they're left to right, by the way. This issue is not a left-right issue. You have religious people from the Religious Zionist Party who are in units with people who are secular leftists from Tel Aviv, and they don't disagree in politics when they're in their units, but they agree on one thing. Why are we going on our fifth call-up, which is completely disruptive to our lives, which, affects our families, affects our livelihoods? Why are we forced to do this over and over and over again, and the Haredi are completely exempt? When Gallant was the defense minister, he sent out 10,000 draft notices to the Haredi community, and something like 48 people showed up, and there was no consequence for not showing up. And because they're the key to this coalition, there's no effort to basically respond to what the Supreme Court has required, that there has to be an equity here. And this is one of the things you can't spin. You can, you can't present to the Israeli public something that sounds great, but belies the reality, because they're living the reality. Spin is when you can fool people because, all they hear is what you're saying. But you can't fool people who are living the reality. And even today, the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are pushing for the total vanquishing, total occupation of Gaza, even on a temporary basis. And the military is saying it takes 4 divisions to do that. And to do that, we will have to have a major call-up again of the reserves. And it's not happening right now because Bibi understands that's not tenable for the moment. Maybe he will do it at some point. But right now, there's enormous resistance to that from 2 sources. Main, the reservists who don't want to have to go back and do this again. And secondly, if you do that, you're sealing the fate of the remaining live hostages, which is profoundly unpopular in Israel.
Well, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. If you aren't a member of the podcast, I urge you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find all previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And I invite you to email me with any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations that you might have to mkrasny at graymatter.show, and that's Gray with an E. I want to thank our indefatigable Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to our guest, Dennis Ross. His book is Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. Thank you, Dennis. Always good to be with you.
Michael, it's always good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm Michael Krasny. We have an addition to our podcast that is, in fact, something that I used to do when I had a regular radio program. I would feature things having to do with public service that I thought were important for listeners to know about, and that's in that vein. Plus, this has a strain of nepotism to it. One of my favorite cousins is Howard Silby, who's a neurologist, retired neurologist, who lives in Washington, and a woman who he has been seeing and who is very important to him is a woman named Eva Hausman, who started something called the Mother's Day Movement, and that's what we're going to find out about. It fascinated me, and I thought it was, especially as we were right near Mother's Day, particularly of interest because there's so much money spent on cards and flowers and candies and all the rest of that. And this is an idea that friends of mine like Nick Kristof have made us aware of and brought to our attention, and that I think the public is well served in finding out about. So welcome, Eva Hausman. Good to have you with us on Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Thank you. I'm honored to be speaking with you.
Well, let's talk about this organization and how it began and where the idea started to flicker in your mind and how you put it into action.
About 15 years ago, I read Half the Sky, Nick Kristof and Cheryl Woodun's Pulitzer Prize-winning book. Subsequently, Nick wrote a piece in the New York Times, and he mentioned me in it. And in that article, he said that $14 billion, billion, not million, was spent on Mother's Day, flowers, cards, etc., as you said, and that could educate 60 million girls in the developing world. And I'm going to quote what he said, because this really is what got us going. It's time to move the apostrophe so that it becomes not just Mother's Day honoring a single mother, but Mother's Day, an occasion to try to help mothers around the globe as well.
Put that apostrophe after the S.
Exactly. My daughter turned to me and said, "Mom, we need to do more." And thus, the Mother's Day movement was born. And I'm going to refer to it as MDM because it's a little easier. The idea is that we want to help women and their families throughout the world. And the process of choosing the charity is very challenging. They have to meet our requirements. And the major requirement is that we can co-brand with them so that the donations go directly to the charity. The Mother's Day movement does not touch money and never has. We have no overhead. We have no expenses. We are essentially an idea. We ask people to rethink giving at Mother's Day. 100%.
100% underwritten, essentially. Yeah, well, that's really to your credit, and that's impressive. And yet we're in an era where it's pretty tough with all the funding cuts and nonprofits suffering and so forth. You have to take a different tack and a different position and sort of reposition yourself?
We chose our charity before things got so bad. One of my tasks that I'm going to be doing very soon is to reach out to all of our 15 past beneficiaries and ask to what degree they have been affected by the cuts. Edesia, which is one that we did very well that year because it featured the video of malnourished children, and they eat something called plumpy nut, which is like a paste, a peanut butter paste, and it can take a malnourished child from, near death to relative health in a few weeks or months. One day they get the funding, the next day the funding's gone. They have ordered their trucks to ship them out, and their biggest orders came from USAID. So now they have all this stuff sitting in their warehouses. It's tragic. But we had chosen Family Promise this year, as I started to say, before the election. And I think it's very important to highlight that Americans also have needs. And we think that this is a very important organization. They have 200 affiliates throughout the country.
And the emphasis has been on holiday for all mothers. Let's underwrite that, or let's put that in italics and big bold letters, because that's at the core of what your purpose is, your raison d'etre. And how can people get involved? How can they contribute?
What I'd like people to know is that for the price of a bouquet of flowers, they can help a mother and her family this year at themothersdaymovement.org. When they make a donation, Family Promise and the Mother's Day Movement provide an e-card. So if, Michael, you were kind enough to make a donation for your wife, she would get a beautiful e-card saying that you have made a donation in honor of another mother on her behalf. So for a friend, for a cousin, they'll do a number of donations, and a donation can be $5 or it can be $5,000. We would very much welcome that. Another way I like to look at it, and I think you might like this, is that Nick Kristof is the father of the movement. We are the Mother's Day movement are the mothers, and the 501c3s that we choose are the children.
Well, it also gives new meaning to the old ideal of somebody who is a brother from another mother or a sister from another mother, because the feeling of, well, fraternity and sorority and closeness and sibling kind of connectedness.
Thank you so very much.
It's all really quite uplifting, and I congratulate you again on what you're doing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for letting us know about this. Have a happy Mother's Day, and good luck and ongoing success with what you're doing, and give my love to my cousin, and
I will.
we will perhaps meet one day in the flesh. I hope so.
I would love that. Thank you very much.
That's Eva Hausman. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.